Hello students, this is Michael Jackman, your instructor. Welcome to my studio. Here I'm going to be presenting a number of short videos for you to look at sort of as overviews to topics that we'll be presenting during the course and discussing. Now, this video is about, is there a difference between poetry and prose? I'm interested mostly in your opinion. I'm not really interested in telling you what to think. I want to use this presentation as a way to explore the issues that are important to you as poets and your future growth. So, watch the presentation. I'll be showing you some examples of poetry and prose. And then in the end, I'm going to ask you either through a poll or through an online form or in some form to give me your opinion. Is there a difference between poetry and prose? What's the difference? What, if anything, happens when something is presented in lines deliberately chosen by the writer versus blocks that have to do more with the method of presentation that's outside the writer's control? Thank you. Hello students, what you're looking at here is an example of writing. On the left we have a prose example and on the right we have a poetry example. On the left we have two paragraphs from the novel A Dance of Dragons by George R.R. Martin. This is part of the Game of Thrones series. And on the right we have an example of former Poet Laureate of the United States Charles Simic, a poem called Pastoral Harpsichord, which appears in his collection The Voice at 3 a.m., which is a great name for a collection. This is an excerpt from the poem. It's the second and third stanzas of this three-stanza poem. Let's have a look at the two in the terms of trying to figure out some things that poetry and prose have in common. And I should point out that in this example, for Charles Simic, we are looking at free verse poetry rather than formal poetry. And that's important for this discussion and for the semester. Now, on the left, you see that there are blocks. And it's, of course, you know, everybody knows by this stage that when you write prose, you tend to form your writing into these arbitrary length blocks called paragraphs. There's no real definition, despite what you may have heard, of what it takes to make a paragraph. And so you have variable numbers of sentences and you have variable numbers of lines. As you can see, here's one paragraph of 2 sentences, and here's another paragraph of 3, 4, 5 sentences. So let's just have a look. One block, one paragraph. In poetry, the equivalent construction is called a stanza. So here we have 2 stanzas, and this stanza is made up of 2 sentences, and this stanza is made up of 1. Both have in common a block unit that writers have at their disposal, using stanzas in poetry and using paragraphs in prose. Another thing that is in common between poetry and prose often is the use of sentences. So here we have a paragraph of prose that's made up of 2 sentences, 1 and 2. And here in poetry, we have a stanza that's made up of 2 sentences as well, 1 and 2. So it's interesting and an accident that my example showed a kind of symmetry. We can even say that both prose and poetry are made up of lines. You could count the lines in prose if you wish to. It's not often done, but it's possible. So here are examples of some lines of prose, and here are examples of some lines of poetry. But here's where there's one important difference. In the case of prose, where the lines go is accidental. We can say that the lines end depending on how the publisher decides to set up the proof for a printed book, or how your app, such as a Kindle, might render it, or how A browser in a web page might also decide to display that paragraph. As a matter of fact, a reader can go into a Kindle and change the size of the letters and even how many words appear in a line. And you can also change the size of the letters in your browser, and you could make your browser wider or more narrow, and depending on how it's set up to display, that will also change the way the paragraphs are rendered. So, the important thing to remember here is that in terms of lines, prose is accidental and it has nothing to do with the intention of the writer. On the other hand, poetry, the lines are completely intentional and have everything to do with the intention of the writer. Sometimes there's more intentionality than others, and there must be some thought behind it. There must be some idea or theory about what makes a good line and what doesn't. Again, I'm talking about free verse poetry here, where the line lengths, the amount of lines per stanza, can be completely arbitrary. So again, to recap, prose and poetry have many similarities. They're both organized, it tends to be in blocks. They both use sentences. They both contain lines, and they both can have sentences that go over the line. They have one important difference for our purposes right now, that the endings of the lines seem to be chosen deliberately by the writer as to where they go. And this is even more important in free verse versus formal poetry. In the next presentation, briefly, I'm going to show you a poem rendered in prose and also rendered in lines, and then ask you to tell me if you think there's a difference. What I want you to do right now is to take a little bit time, maybe a minute or so, and read out loud the two excerpts here, the two paragraphs from George Martin and the two stanzas from Charles Simic. Read it out loud and put the sounds in your head and think about what might be different between poetry and prose or what might be the same. Thank you. Here is a silent summary of the points so far. Now ask yourself, does the difference between these two presentations, poetry and prose, make a difference? What I've done here, students, is to first take George R.R. Martin's excerpt from A Dance with Dragons and attempt to render it as a poem. So above, you see the paragraphs as I originally presented them, although you can already tell that in using Word, the line endings are different. And below the original prose, I have attempted, in some sort of attempt to turn this into something different, to take the exact same words, the exact same punctuation. I haven't changed a thing other than to put it in lines where I've given some kind of thought to the end words and the length of the lines. And you can see that in this rendering, the lines are uneven. They are various lengths, and that I've decided sometimes to end my lines with a word as simple as the word a, or an article, and sometimes with verbs or progressives, ing words, and sometimes with stronger verbs or adjectives rather. and sometimes with nouns. I did it internally without applying any kind of theory other than some kind of feeling that I wanted to create. Now what I want you to do is to read both of these examples, and it works best, I tell you, and it's very important for poets to get used to doing this, not to read them with a voice inside your head, but you must read them aloud, because English words have sounds, and sounds are very important for poetry. So take a minute and read it to yourself out loud, however you want to read it, and think, is there any difference between reading it as a prose paragraph or reading it as a poem stanza in free verse? And then we'll talk about this. Now here, students, is an example of the Charles Simic poem, Pastoral Harpsichord, done as the original version on the top, and done as one paragraph here on the bottom. Now there's a couple of things to note here before you try reading this on your own. The first thing is that I had to do some spelling changes in order to put this into paragraphs. That is, you can see the way Charles Simic had this printed, the beginning of each line has a capital letter. This use of capitals is a convention for poetry, although it's not the only one. Many poets nowadays, when they write free-verse poems, only capitalize letters that would normally be capitalized in a prose sentence and abandon this convention. And there's a trick to using word that I can show you where word won't force you to do so. There's something else I want to show you. As you can see, word has made what I like to call the squiggly green line, which means it's alerting me to something about grammar. If I right-click, then I see that it tells me that I have written a fragment and I should consider revising. Word, Microsoft Word that is, which most of you will be using for the class, I'm sure, has a habit of telling poets what to do when poets would rather not follow such grammatical advice. But it is worth noting for the future that when you do render prose into lines, or when you write poetry in line form, you are essentially often presenting fragments of sentences to the viewer visually. And that's something else to put into your consideration about whether, in the end, that is something that makes a difference between writing poetry and prose. I'm going to end this segment by giving you the instruction to read both excerpts out loud to yourself, take your time, and then think about whether it seems different as a poem, different as prose, and whether maybe there's something about the language that causes this difference. Again, this is your opinion. I'm not telling you what to think. I have my own opinion, but I want to discuss this with you as poets. Okay, now we'll move on to a final example. Here you can see Edna St. Vincent Millay sonnet number 43 and a prose version that I've created. Because a sonnet is a formal poem, this particular one is in an Italian sonnet style, and it did not separate the stanzas, 14 lines, and of course it has a rhyme scheme. So you have Y, lane, rain, sigh, A-B-B-A rhyme scheme. I thought it would be a wonderful experiment for you to read the sonnet out loud, which is a poem whose form determines the amount of syllables in a line, where the accents go, or the main louder accents go in the rhythm, and how many accents there are, and what the rhyme scheme is. So this entire poem, written in iambic pentameter, which we'll learn about or review later, can you read this as prose, as opposed to the free verse poems that I showed you so far? Charles Simic may read a certain way in prose, or it may not. Again, we'll see when you do the experiment. What about this one? So take a few minutes to read the sonnet aloud, and then read it in a prose form, and see what you come up with as far as whether it makes a difference, whether a poem is rendered in lines, or in right justified paragraphs. A couple of more things about this one. You can see that Word wants to tell me something about the grammar. So let's look and see what Word is telling me. Word is telling me that I should not place a comma between tonight and that. In other words, Word is telling me to correct Edna St. Vincent Millay's punctuation. You can see what the problem of Word can be for poets. It's giving a standard English rendering of grammar, and the rule you may or may not have remembered that tells you whether to use which or that, and a comma and no comma, has something to do with whether you have restricted clauses or unrestricted clauses. Well, perhaps that rule needs some reconsideration in light of what Edna St. Vincent Millay did. Oh, by the way, one other interesting thing, I can't resist. Here's one sentence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines, and here's one sentence, 6 lines long. So the entire, what we call Petrarchian sonnet form that consists of 14 lines is divided in two, as are the sentences divided in two. In this case, it doesn't have to be that way. After you've done the experiment, you want to pause this. Go ahead and look at this. What you're seeing here is what's known as a prose poem. This is a poem by a very famous contemporary poet, Vietnam War veteran named Yusef Komunyakaa. I like to teach it because it has wonderful renderings of wartime experience from Vietnam, as well as identity and other themes that are strongly placed inside this poem. Again, the question is, reading this in prose, since it's called a prose poem, is there a difference between prose the way that you understand it, and does the presentation make a difference? So in all these ways, we have some things to consider that are very important for poetry. Now it's time for your opinion. Go back and read the excerpt from Dance of Dragons and from Pastoral or Pastoral Harpsichord. Read them aloud and think about the differences between the two, given what you now know. Read aloud the poems in their poetic and in their prose renderings, Simic, Millay, and Komunyakaa, which is like a monkey wrench thrown into the conveyor belt because it is a genre called a prose poem, so it only has one form. And then write down in the form that I'll direct you to online, is there a difference between poetry and prose? Explain your answer and refer to our examples. Does the fact that poetry is presented using stanzas and lines with deliberate line breaks make poetry any different from prose, which is presented in blocks of arbitrary paragraphs that have nothing to do, if you recall, about the writer's intent? And a bonus question for you, if you have some time to think even more extremely, how does the hybrid form known as the prose poem, for example, Komunyakaa's Grenade, complicate your answer? I want to say thank you very much, students, for your thoughts and opinions. I'm looking forward to discussing this with you when I see you.